started here. Welcome, everybody. It is April 29th. This is the Certification Network Group virtual meeting. This is our first official meeting of the year for the virtual committee, virtual group. So we're just going to go ahead and jump in and get started. I think we have a really good program for everyone today. I'm Chris Capistran. I am one of the board members for CNG, and I'm the liaison for the virtual committee. Belinda, who is our chair, Belinda Brenner, is not here today, so I'm going to fill in for her and do a quick intro before I hand it off to Stephanie and the crew for the panel discussion. So here's our quick schedule. We'll do a quick welcome, thank some sponsors, do a quick sponsor presentation. We'll do an hour of the panel discussion, and then at the end, we'll have time to wrap up any announcements, job openings, things like that. And I've been told that we'll probably be out of here in less than an hour and a half, but people have told me that before and it never happens. But I'm not one of the panelists, so hopefully it'll go relatively quickly. So first we have to thank all of our sponsors. If you don't know this, CNG is a 100% volunteer-run organization. It is also fully supported. The only way we exist is through our sponsors. So thank you to our full sponsors. These are industry partners who provide support to the organization. I'm not going to list everybody. Here's the first half of the alphabet. The next slide is the rest of the sponsors. So thank you to that. And then also, once again, we have our supporting sponsors, which is the next group. These are organizations within the industry that also help us through some support as well. So thank you to all the sponsors for supporting that. And then I'm going to bring Stephanie on, who actually happens to also be the moderator for today's session. But Bench Prep is our featured sponsor. So if you're not a sponsor yet, know that you get your logo on the slides on the website, but you also get the opportunity to give a quick 5-minute pitch of your organization at the different meetings. So today, Bench Prep is our featured sponsor, and I'm going to let Stephanie jump in and talk for a few minutes about Bench Prep.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry, you all might get bored of my voice as I'm going to be the moderator as well. But just a quick introduction. We are excited to be a sponsor for this specific session. I'm also on the virtual CNG committee here. I'm Stephanie Frankel. I'm the Enterprise Account Executive over at Bench Prep as well. We are, again, honored and so excited to be launching this first CNG virtual event. It seems like it's a really great turnout, so got good traction. So thank you everyone for participating today. Real quick, a little bit about Bench Prep is we provide a centralized and intuitive platform for learners who can access structured content, track their progress, earn CE credit hours, and demonstrate achievements. So basically what that means is we support the lifelong learner journey by powering up personalized, flexible, and engaging learning experiences that evolve with the learner's needs. So from everything with certification prep and training to ongoing professional development and continuing education. Specifically today, we help tie in with kind of this firewall accreditation issue that we hear a lot in the industry today. So what we do is we help credentialing association bodies navigate this firewall by enabling the delivery of high quality learning experiences without compromising the independence of their assessment or certification process. So there's a few ways that we do this. One, we provide a separate learner focused platform. So that operates independently from the certification exam engine, ensuring the certification process remains impartial and secure. We allow organizations to manage access and permissions so that different teams can operate with clearly defined roles and boundaries, not commingling and intermixing with integrity of items and that sort of thing. And then we help track CE credit hours and engagement metrics in a way that supports learning without influencing or interfering with those exam outcomes. And lastly, supporting integrations and firewall data flows so that your systems can talk to each other, whether each other when needed, but also in ways that will comply with those accreditation standards as well. So with that being said, thanks again for having us be a sponsor, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation and panel today.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, we also rely not only on the sponsors, but our volunteers. So just a quick shout out to, here's the current CNG board. You see myself, Tara, who's our chair, is also one of the panelists today, so you get to hear more from her. But again, thank you to everyone who volunteers for that. And then also, in addition to the board, we have our program committees. So we have, today this is the virtual group, but we also, as you know, have in-person events in DC and Chicago. So these are all the people that help us put these events together, planning, getting the speakers, getting the spaces, and just doing the general coordination of that. So thank you to everybody who has volunteered and anyone who is interested in volunteering or sponsoring. We can always use more help. So you can see that the Chicago list is pretty long, but the DC and the virtual one is a little bit shorter. So we could always use, always looking for more people to help. People have busy lives, so having extra people around can never hurt. So anyone who's interested, just please reach out and let us know. And now I'm just going to hand it over to Liz real quick to talk about ICE.
All right. Good morning. I think morning, half afternoon for some folks. There's a lot going on at ICE. Lovely little snapshot here. Things to highlight. NCCA applications are due tomorrow. If this is a surprise to you, yes, it is too late. Yes, someone always asks. So the deadline after this is August 31st, which might be a more realistic deadline if you have not started the process yet. Happy to talk about it afterwards. A zillion workshops and educational events coming up. The big highlight is, if you haven't read it, the NCCA did release their AI guidance document about a month ago, well, earlier this month. I'm going to drop a live link to that into the chat as well if you are like me and you hate QR codes. And then I also am going to drop into the chat a registration link for the NCCA town hall that they're hosting on May 14th. That will help folks understand the AI guidance document. One note for the town hall is, as you know, the NCCA or staff like myself do not provide consultation. So this town hall will really be to explain that NCCA guidance document and to go through it as a group, but not to provide individual use cases. Any questions about events, feel free to send me a note through the chat or reach out, send me an email afterwards. I'll get you connected with the right person on the team to get you signed up for things.
Thank you, Liz.
All right, thanks.
Oh.
And real quickly, just to go over some housekeeping items, feel free to stay on mute while you're listening. I see a lot of you are utilizing the chat feature already, so thank you. Continue to drop in any questions into that chat feature as we go. And then we will save some time, as the agenda showed earlier, for some more Q&A as well.
Stephanie, one more housekeeping item there.
Yep.
Some people had all of their AI bots and recorders and chat thingamajigs. Just so you know, I rejected all of those requests for them to join. So we'll send the recording out at the end of this for everybody, but recording it or doing your own transcript, we're gonna hold off on that for now, and we will be sending out the official recorded copy once the event is over. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. Today we have Tara Myers. She is the Director of Measurement Services over at ANCC. Liz Dombrowski, Manager of Accreditation Services over at ICE. And we have Dr. Roy Swift, the Executive Director over at WorkCred. So before we get started, I just want to highlight some of the session objectives. First is going to be that we want to clarify the distinction between education and certification to address concerns about maintaining a firewall between the two. We want to demystify common misconceptions around integrating learning products into the certification process. Explore strategies for developing impactful learning experiences that align with candidate needs and expectations. Highlight the strategic value of learning products in driving engagement, growth, and organizational relevance. And lastly, offer practical guidance for aligning education initiatives with accreditation and certification standards. So with that being said, Tara, if you want to go ahead and dive in and just give everyone some more context as to essentially what is the firewall and why is this necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And for those of you who don't know me, fair warning, I'm not very good at sitting still. So that plays off much differently in person than on camera. So I appreciate your patience on that. So the firewall, essentially what we're talking about is when you want your certification program accredited, and really for best practice anyway, you want to have some distinction between any of the test prep stuff and the certification stuff. So you have different people doing the test development, you have different staff, different SMEs. A lot of this we're going to talk about as we go along is how to kind of make that happen. But the idea is that, I mean, when we say firewall, it's different people have, here I go, moving around. Different people have, your organizations have different widths of their firewall, right? So some are very conservative and they really keep things very separate, and I will say something about that later, because we used to be really like this, and then we sort of slowly, we still have the firewall, but it doesn't have to be quite as big as we had it. So, but I mean, generally the idea is you don't want to seem like or to have a conflict of interest where people are teaching to the test or they've gotten some information ahead of time and then their test takers have an unfair advantage when they go to sit for the exam, so which is part of why we have to be really careful about who's doing the test development. But there's also language, right? We can't really say this is the best test prep stuff you're going to find, even if it's your company that's developed it, because it gives people the wrong idea. So it's like you're not really endorsing or you're not saying this is the only one. You're not saying this is the one that you have to take in order to sit for our exam. And you have to be really, really careful to explain that it doesn't guarantee that people are going to pass. So it just really kind of goes around and sits in the center, if that makes sense, of fairness, right? It's all about fairness for our test takers. So that's what I have for this one. I know that we're going to have some redundancy here, but it gets kind of fun as we go along.
Thanks, Sarah. And I know Roy wanted to touch on some of maybe the principles of the firewall.
Right. And a lot of times firewalls can be in the eye of the beholder. Uh, but I think there's one basic question you have to ask yourself. Whatever you're doing, in whatever way, does it affect the validity of the examination? That's the bottom line. And so whatever you decide to do, then you need to backtrack and say, would what we're doing give anyone any, as Tara say, unfair advantages to this? And so that's why I start with one of the principles. Preparatory tours can be good, but it depends. As a lot of times, the devil, the details, devil's in the details of what you do, because in the ideal world, I didn't put this on the slide, but this might cause some discussion, which would be good. In the ideal world, it could be that the whole industry should be doing the job task analysis to verify and validate the body of knowledge. And then each sector, whatever they're doing, they go separately and develop the credential that they are developing. No one does that. But the basic line is that what we want people to know is what the body of the knowledge are, and do they have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do it. And there are different pathways of helping people go in that direction. And that's why we always say that individuals who teach the courses cannot have any relationship with the certification body or processes. It just is so easy to all of a sudden the instructor say, well, this probably could be on the examination, even if they don't know for sure. So it may lead people to advantage, or it could be a disadvantage to people because they're giving the wrong information to them in this regard. And then prep courses must not teach to what they think the test questions are, as I said, but should strictly follow the certification test blueprint that should be public information. Everybody should know these are the domains, these are the tasks that we expect somebody who is certified or have a certificate, maybe they have a certificate, to have some of these skills, but certification being a more process to ensure that competencies have been assessed properly. As you know, competency-based education is only beginning to be looked at the higher education arena. And then there is no concept about how competency education should be aligned to the assessment tools and how that connection should be. The other issue about the prep courses is that WorkCred was involved in a grant with APLU, the American Public and Land Grant Universities, and UPSEA, which is the continuing education group of land grant colleges. And we brought certification bodies into focus groups with these land grant universities. We spent 2 hours talking about what a validated competency is. The difference of opinion, what constitutes validated competencies, is very wide gap, and it really is in need of a lot of discussion between the certification community and the academic community. But the problem as it relates to our subject today is that if academia is putting 10 people in a room and saying these are validated competencies and teaching courses in that way, that's problematic. When we say, well, not only did we have 10 or 25 in a room, we had a validation survey that had 1,000 people. And that only after that did we say that we had validated competencies to evaluate. So the conceptual difference between the two is one that really has to work out. We see that a lot, and also our other grant where we are embedding certifications into degree pathways or certificate pathways to understand how their courses must align with that test blueprint, or we're going to set up students for failure because there's going to be differences and they're going to fail the test, not because they didn't know the material, but they knew the wrong material. In that regard. So those are risks that we have to look at. And then any assessment should be testing the content presented in the course and measure whether learning of the content was achieved. That's quite different than the certification exam, which is looking at assessing practice in the job, not whether you learn content in a course. Very conceptual differences between the two. And then the results of the examination must not be seen as a predictor for success on the certification exam. And unfortunately, especially if somebody is allowing a university to conduct a prep course, I won't name the organizations involved, but when I was involved with the ANSI accreditation program under 17,024, we had a major university, a well-known university, who was conducting a prep course, and the way they were wording it made it look like they were ensuring success, that you would even be certified with this prep course. And so we asked that certification body, we didn't go to that university, we made the certification body go to the university and tell them they had to change their wording about how they presented the prep course that they were giving. And then practice exams should be more about process and not content. At times, failure on the certification exam may have to do with no familiarity with standardization. In another research grant of our research that we're doing, we're seeing that there is a high failure rate on certification exams at the community college level of education. And we think that sometimes it has nothing to do with content, but it has to do with synthesizing students to how to take a standardized exam, and that there are certain populations that we test probably really must be very important to, you don't have to mandate it, but certainly strongly encourage, so that they have an equal playing field of passing that exam. So I think I've said enough for the morning, and I'll pass it on.
You know, Jeffrey had a good point, and something that I had thought of when Roy was talking too, is we are saying this as sort of black and white, and it isn't, because it's not like if you worked on the exam, you could never work on the prep and vice versa, but you need to have something in place, some policies in place that say it's a certain amount of time, right? So 3 years, 5 years, 2 years, whatever your organization has decided, or if it's spelled out in the accreditation. It's just that you can't be doing both at the same time. You can't go straight from one to the other.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that should really be in a policy
Yes.
statement. Yeah, absolutely.
And part of the commitment to serve, whatever they sign for NDA and commitment to serve and all of that.
So that should be just clarified. That depends on the certification standard or your policies and procedures.
I think that that's
The word cannot is not. I don't think the word cannot is appropriate. Seems indefinite.
Yes, I agree. That's where we were kind of trying to back out of that language and say it's not cannot, but that's a little too black and white. And as industry best practice, whether you're getting something accredited or not, you should have that as your policy.
Yeah, I think that's pretty debatable. The cannot. I put it in. It's me that put cannot, because it's a slippery slope, and frankly, even somebody who was away from it for 2 or 3 years may have an advantage of understanding how the domains are done, and provide an unfair advantage. So it really, certainly, you determine your risk that you want to take on that.
That's true.
Sort of thing. But I still think it's a slippery slope that you have to be very, very careful of.
Yeah.
But the standard does allow you to assess that risk.
Yeah. And it's
I think it's an important point, because there are definitely groups on this call, and they need to understand that the international standards allows you to assess that risk.
agreed. And
Well, when you say international attendee, are you talking about 17,024?
Yep, that's the section I put in verbatim in the chat. and it
Well,
says,
I helped write
uh, I
17,024, and
I know you did, Roy.
I'm not sure that it's not that flexible. You would have to really prove the independence on that.
It says 2 years, Roy.
Uh,
Okay. I was so perhaps we can
like
have
we
another
said, it's
discussion
debatable.
offline.
We can go downhill with that one. Yeah.
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 I would say, in addition to what Roy said about assessing the risk, there's also the question of how many SMEs do you have available to you? And that can influence how long that period is, because sometimes it's, you're running out of people who can participate in either one of those things. So
Excellent.
Well, I will say that Roy started by saying firewalls can be different depending upon the eye of the beholder. So I'm going to talk briefly about what the NCCA says, and this is their worldview of what the principles of the firewall are. So if you're not familiar with the NCCA standards, they go through everything from soup to nuts. Standard 3, though, is what we're specifically I'm going to highlight today, which is Standard 3, education, training, and certification. And you can see it's listed here at the top of the slide. Appropriate separation must exist between certification and any education or training functions to avoid conflict of interest and to protect the integrity of the certification program. That sounds lovely. It sounds lofty, but it's also very much open to interpretation. So if you're not familiar with the standards and the setup themselves, the way that they're broken out is when someone applies for NCCA accreditation, they must demonstrate that they are compliant with each of the essential elements underneath the standard. So for standard 3, there's 2 essential elements, 3A and 3B. And then the commission, the NCCA, the National Commission for Certifying Agencies, provides commentary underneath every standard that helps people understand and interpret the standard. So the commentary is not the rules themselves, but rather how to read and understand and interpret those rules that are listed under the standard and those essential elements. So a few things I wanted to highlight about standard 3 is that it clarifies the role and the impartiality as it relates to initial certification. So under the NCA standards, when we talk about this firewall, we're talking about initial certification. There are rules, there are requirements for continuing education, depending on an organization or a program may structure that. But the firewall itself in this context is referring to if there is an initial education requirement in order to sit the certification exam. So if education or any type of training is a prerequisite, the certification program must ensure the impartiality of the process to identify what's acceptable. If it's an acceptable type of education program, an acceptable accreditation body that they're looking at for the prerequisite education, they must demonstrate that that process by which they're picking those things that are eligible versus not is an impartial process. And then there also is that cooling off period for subject matter experts, to what some folks were mentioning before. I'm not going to speak for 17024. For NCCA, it comes down to what is your rationale. So if you're saying that people can move within 2 years from doing preparation for the exam and writing your items and being your subject matter experts there before they have to cool off for 2 years, we'll say, before they jump to the other side of the house, why is that 2 years appropriate? Is it, or do you have another metric? Is it that they're basically cooling off until you release a new job task analysis? Or do you burn your forms so quickly that you know within the year the forms that they personally worked on were no longer going to be in circulation? So the NCCA's perspective is, what is your policy and then what is your rationale for that policy? So they review not only the policy itself, but also the rationale. And what that means is that there are accredited programs out there. They might have different cooling off periods for different types of subject matter experts, depending on what parts of the exam development process they were involved in. Do you have a different requirement for your certification board members versus someone who did form review one time? So you might have some combination thereof. The other things that I wanted to talk through is under 3B, there are very explicit guardrails that the NCCA standards outlines. If the organization itself that offers the certification program also then decides to get involved in the prep course business. It's not required. And when I say prep course, that's my colloquialism for any type of prerequisite education or training that could lead to someone sitting the exam, be it required training as one of the pathways or one of the optional pathways. And what's very important here under standard 3B is that it must be optional, by which I mean if there are multiple prerequisite courses to sit your exam, you cannot force people to take the one that you offer in-house. And there's a very specific, deliberate language that the NCCA does review to ensure that it's on your website, it's on your materials, that you really do walk that walk and talk that talk. So you don't want to create that pay for play environment because that does impact the potential integrity and credibility of your program. So I think that's the bright and brief. I will drop.
I might add,
Yes.
though, Liz, that prerequisites probably should be looked at very differently than preparatory courses, because all the healthcare people have to accept accredited academic programs in order to sit for their exams. So they have no, they accept what the industry has required, that regardless of what's in that, and accredited academic programs really differ. They have different flavors, but because the prerequisite policy is you must have graduated from an accredited program, accredited type of thing, it's automatically accepted with no evaluation. The evaluation is that it was accredited, basically.
So I was reading, so the NCCA has wonderful case history documentation that they use internally. And this came up because they were considering an issue, or they will be soon. So apologies if you're on the commission and you haven't read the agenda for our next meeting yet. There's a program that has some questions about accreditation requirements for prerequisite courses. So I go digging through the archives and whatnot. And once upon a time, there was an organization that required accreditation for someone to be a prerequisite program to offer them, but they were the organization that offered the accreditation. So they were the ones picking who could play in the sandbox. And so there is a lot of nuance there. So even it's not as simple as even third-party accreditation when you own the third-party accrediting board. So the NCCA really does look at the structure to ensure that impartiality and integrity, because the reality is that, and this is more a personal opinion, that when it comes to the firewall, the perception is just as important as the actual policies and procedures on the books. How does your community perceive how you're implementing the firewall? Do they perceive it as fair? Or is the perception in your community that your prep class has to be the only thing that drives exam success? If so, what does that actually mean for your program itself and how people perceive that certification in the field?
Thank you, Liz. So now let's go ahead. I have a few panel questions to kick us off. The first panel question is going to be particularly over to Tara's end of the realm. Really, what was the initial stance of your organization on exam prep, and what changed your perspective?
Yeah, this is a funny one because when I first started, I say like 10 years ago, we had, and we still do, but we handle it a little differently. We had two different organizational entities, meaning it's a different board of directors and everything that do the certification program, including the exams, and the test prep. And the test prep was like part of our membership organization, or the parent company, and we're the credentialing organization. And it was a long time where the underlying idea was we couldn't talk to each other. I mean, like, people were afraid to talk to each other in the kitchen or at an event. And it just doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that. And so, yeah, so that's where I say we've like narrowed that firewall. For one thing, we're all part of the same overall organization, and it just doesn't make sense. There's lots of things we have to talk about that aren't to do with the test prep. So that's one thing that changed. Another thing that changes, we've found a bit of a middle ground. So my department, Measurement Services, creates the certification exams, and Educational Resources creates a test prep. That includes practice tests and whatnot. My department creates sample questions that we put on the website, which I'm sure a lot of certifying bodies do. And then we have something in the middle that we introduced a few years ago. We call it a readiness test. And it speaks a little bit to what Roy was saying in terms of it's less about the content and more about the process. So the idea is for test takers to go take the test in the area that they're going to take it. So if you're going to go to a certain testing center, you go there to take the readiness test. The initial goal of that was to lower anxiety. So if we're talking about, fairness and validity and well, like test anxiety creates all sorts of noise in our scores. So, and I, for one, you may have gathered, I have a fair amount of anxiety. And so for me, going to something like that was like, I'd go the day before, because I like how am I getting there? Where do I park? What are the security measures? Like all of the things, where are the that was quite overwhelming. And I dare say I'm probably not the only one. And so that was the main reason why we kind of did an in-between sample questions and practice tests, which is the full test and So this is a shortened version, but it is timed, it's proctored, it's all of those things. We also use items for those exams that are either retired but still relevant, or they're really very good items, but they don't quite hit our standard for becoming a scored item on the certification test. So it is, it's just a middle ground. It's a little bit fuzzy. So it's not really test prep, but it's feeling prepared. It's feeling ready. And we do have different editors working on the items. We have different SMEs working on the items. But some of those do come from the item bank. So it's not 100%. But when we build the forms, we review the items, we set the cut scores, all of that is done with different staff and different subject matter experts. So those are I'm hoping that there's going to be even more of an evolution. And so that's one of the things. I'm glad we're talking to Education Resources now, because that's one of the things we're sort of working through. Like, well, what would it look like if we did X, Y? There's only so much they can do, and there's only so much we can do. So what should be us and what should be them, and how do we do it, and what's best for the organization? So as a whole, instead of like, this is mine and that's yours and never shall we meet. So I've found that to be a really positive change without any, I mean, there's no risk to our programs or the accreditation because of the way that we've managed that.
So basically, Tara, what you're saying is once you kind of found that fine line of division between the different groupings, that's when you were able to come to the conclusion we can actually offer this preparation for our learners and users, but you just had to define those lines and parameters essentially.
Yes, exactly. And I did go to some of the accreditors and say, I went to some of the trainings and I says, hey, what about this? And they're like, yeah. So, if in doubt, sometimes you can get, see, if you have questions, Liz, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you have questions, sometimes you can talk to somebody at your accrediting body, at the organization and say, I don't know how to interpret this or whatever your question is. So.
Yes, absolutely. You can always talk to me. I feel like, and I feel like this is the same for 17024, is that staff is available to help people understand the standard. They are not there to be your business consultants. That is a line that they can't cross. Probably you don't want me to cross because I don't know the ins and outs of your specific program. But helping people understand the guardrails is essential because all your business decisions come from that. So yes, we can talk is the short answer.
Frankly, before we make any big changes, we're like, so we're thinking about doing this, and we can usually get a pretty good sense of whether we're on the right track or not.
Awesome. And Sheila,
I think it's essential that the certification committee has got to talk more to higher education and post-secondary and training, because there are so many misconceptions between the industries about what it is. And we found that out with our grant, that we needed people in the same room talking about this is how we look at assessment and measurement. And it's so different than how the academic community looks at it in this regard. And so the more we understand each other, the more, because WorkRed believes that there is a way to integrate credentials to produce better outcomes. And better outcomes these days is getting a job, maintaining it, and having a good salary. That's what everybody's going to be judged on. It's not, a lot of the universities say, oh, we have a 99% pass rate on the exam. Well, that's not going to get it anymore. 99% is good, but did you help people get jobs is really how the universities are going to be evaluated. And frankly, the certification is going to be evaluated in that way, because the power of the states talking about what are credentials of value. And the people who can demonstrate that are going to be the ones that will be recognized by the states. And so our community has really got to look at how we begin putting more emphasis on policy people at the state level in order to be recognized as credentials of value.
we did have a question come in from Sheila. She said, if you use retired certification exam items for voluntary non-required practice exams, one, can you provide feedback that shows how their performance compared when these items were administered on the real test, or does that give insider information? And then two, can staff psychometricians who have nothing to do with exam content but focus only on the statistical aspects of an item work on both the practice exams and the certification exams?
I feel like
I'm
that's
very sorry
probably
because I was starting to write an answer in the chat. So you guys go ahead, and then I'll catch up if I can.
okay. We
I
will
would
try.
say if the psychometrician has knowledge of the exam items, even if they're just doing statistics, then that's a conflict of interest, because they're going to know. They can't then switch over and develop the exam for the prep course because they have both sets of knowledge in this regard. At least that's my perspective.
So I'll say that the NCCA doesn't prohibit programs for using retired certification exam items. It's outside the scope of the standards. We can have like a whole hour conversation about, is that a good idea? why or why not. There's a lot of arguments for why that may not be a good use case, yada yada. That's a very different session. I would say that, to Roy's point, if someone's playing on both sides of the fence, for NCCA, one of the things that you must give us is your organizational chart. So the NCCA commissioners are going to look at your organizational chart. Who does what? And if they see someone playing on both sides of the fence, there will be questions about how and why and how that's appropriate. Because again, I'll go back and I'll probably say this 3 more times. It's not just how you structure the firewall, but also how is that perceived. So if it came out to your candidate population that the person who's in the room when the test is written also wrote your practice exam and is running those numbers, what does that say about that integrity of that practice exam to your community? So there's both sides of the fence here. I feel like you need an actual psychometrician to chime in on the technical questions, which I do not play one on TV. Do you want to try it though, Tara?
Nope. I think you guys
Nope.
hit it. Yep. I would say the exact same thing.
Awesome. All right, let's go to our second question then. What are the most common misunderstandings about the exam firewall, and how can we clarify these misunderstandings? Essentially, how do we demystify those common misconceptions? I think, Liz, you had a good point if you wanted to kick this one off.
Sure. I would say that long before I was in my current role, I worked at a certifying body, and we were one of those programs that didn't touch anything that resembled test prep with a 10-foot pole. I mean, granted, this is 15 years ago, thinking is over evolved, but I remember just discussions and discussions about could we have 5 questions on the website to give people a feel about what it was like. There was no prep whatsoever. There was very rigorous education and experience requirements and yada yada, like we're all familiar with. And just watching that program evolve long since I've left the organization to now, they have prep courses, they have a practice exam. So there's been a lot of evolution in the industry. So I'm making the assumption that many of us grew up with the requirement, the firewall is thou shall do nothing related to test preparation, that the risk is too high. And I've seen certification programs grow and evolve to be more about that comprehensive education, but the line still exists. And I feel like the conversation has moved towards a place where it is more nuanced. It's about how that firewall and that integrity is being communicated. So the standards will always be the baseline minimum. Programs still can decide to have a more rigorous firewall, to have more rigorous standards, to not touch anything that resembles test prep. And that is their definition of how the firewall is implemented in their organization because of business industry practices, whatever else. But when we talk about the firewall, it's who has access to what materials. Does anybody who is playing in the prep space, be it your education or your whatnot, do they have access to anything that could be considered confidential exam material? The goal is definitely not. But then also you have to throw that optics conversation back in. So how is that perceived to your public? And that's where your firewall may get a little more rigorous based upon your industry or not. And again, I feel like it's the NCCA standards specifically will tell you the baseline minimum that the industry expects for an accredited program to uphold. But this is a very nuanced, probably board level conversation about where a specific program chooses to play as part of that overarching business strategy. And, you know, Tara's program's done a great job of restructuring that over the years.
Awesome, thank you. Tara, Roy, do you have any comments on this particular area? All right. I have actually a question for the audience, and some of you have actually chimed in to kind of help answer this question, but feel free to go on unmute yourself and give your kind of input on this. But how many of you are currently offering exam prep in some form? And if you're not, what is holding you back? And I saw some answers already in the chat as to why you don't currently offer it, but if anyone wants to speak up, and feel free, go ahead.
I mean, I can talk about ICE for 5 seconds while people think.
Sure.
ICE offers
I can
test
jump
prep.
in.
Oh, even better.
Yes, I'm Farah Rodrigue. I work at the Society of Defense Financial Management. And so we certify defense financial managers. And we currently run a practice test that is mainly created from retired items. And this is a revenue source for the certification department specifically. So I just wanted to share that. And honestly, we didn't see any issues with it in the past because it's simply focused on retired items. So we don't see a conflict, and it's obviously voluntary, subscription based. So I would be happy to hear your thoughts on that.
See, Ron's got his hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, retired items are, I know I've worked with organizations that have had retired items, but I always look at the idea of why they're retired. Why are they retired? Is there's something wrong with the item? Is it because the item might, basically, it's no longer in practice. So, those kind of things. Anyway, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's levels of effectiveness in terms of the items. So as long as you're checking to make sure they're still relevant and accurate, because sometimes they're retired because you just feel they've had enough exposure. Enough people have seen it. So sometimes, especially if that's the case, it's like, okay, or sometimes, instead of like resting your items, you just you retire them after a certain amount of people have seen them. That's assuming you have a really amazing item bank, of course.
Excellent. Looks like people are chiming in on the chat too. A lot of people are saying they do offer some type of learning prep, whether that is just prep or possibly practice tests. So it's good to see there are a lot of organizations out there that are starting to dabble into this space. Good feedback. Thank you, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next panel question. What strategies would you recommend for organizations looking to start offering exam prep services, but are still concerned about that accreditation firewall? Any tips, tricks, insights that you would give those who are a little bit more hesitant?
I think we started touching on some of them. I got too excited and worked ahead. But, some of it is thinking through like your subject matter expert pool and, how many people do you have that could work on this, both in terms of volunteers and staff. There's also, I like things like this, and talking to people who've done it. And talking to accreditors and thinking through, I really like that distinction between the strategy versus the, sort of operations of it all. I see lots of hands up, so I'll be quiet.
Jeffrey, I saw your hand go up first.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And so what I typically advise, so I have a consulting firm that does work with clients on these programs. What I typically advise clients is to, again, separate what I call scheme side, which is content, exam development, question analysis. And then I say you also have a business side, and your business side is promotion, training. Separate those two very distinctly on your organizational chart, as someone mentioned. Now, there was some questions in the chat about, do they have to be separate staff? And again, my familiarity is with 17024. 17024 talks about threat analyses and what's going on in your organization, how that might be a threat to impartiality. So if you have a small staff, you just make sure that staff understands at this time of the activity, you are on the scheme side, and you're very careful about scheme activities. 2 days later, you might be on the business side, and you're very careful not to leak scheme side stuff to your business side stuff. And then eventually, over a year's period of time, you might have a threat analysis or discussions about you worked on this over a 2-day period. Were you able to separate out, and did anything come up that you might be concerned that you are leaking information back and forth? And when that time comes, you identify it, you develop an activity to fix it, and then you move on. So they can live together. You just have to be very demonstrative about it and very transparent about it.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And I see Judith, you
Sure.
have your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. Real quickly, I also am a consultant like Jeffrey, and I have clients that have both the business side and the credentialing side. And I don't know why the business side couldn't see the results of the job task analysis, because they would use that set results to help decide what the training needs are. They would use that to set the learning objectives, build the learning strategies and tactics and things like that. So I don't see that as a conflict of interest. They're using the same source document. What they're not doing is looking at the products that each produces. See? So, and so I make that kind of distinction that way. And I keep, some people think that the training side can't see the job task analysis. So what are they supposed to do? Just have epiphanies and come up with
Right.
content? So we all should be working from the same source, because we are, in terms of perception, we're all preparing our constituents for some public promise, whatever that is. That's all.
I agree. I mean, if
That
the
was
job task analysis does have the blueprint as the product, and you give that blueprint is public, and then once you look at the blueprint, if your staff wants to say, well, can you give me a sense on why this was 28%? I don't see why sharing that information is illegal. So I think you're absolutely right. You should be able to share that.
Well, that's what I said at the beginning, but it has to do with going beyond that and looking at, and 17,024 has a whole section on the 5.2 structure of the certification body in relationship to training, which it talks about impartiality and not compromising the validity of the examination. And so making sure everybody understands what the official body of knowledge is not a problem. It's when there is specific knowledge about the examination development that where the firewall needs to begin, because that will affect the validity, because then the people will do splintered learning of, oh, I just need to know this, this, and this. I don't have to study the whole thing, when they have knowledge. Where they don't, if they have just the job analysis or the test blueprint, then it's a level playing field, because we're just talking about the body of knowledge that one needs to know in order to perform that role or occupation.
Roy, this is Judy, and I want to let Tara have her voice here. I would also say that people who write training, develop training instructional materials, prep materials, should also know how to write good items. They should be able, given the same kind of training. Now, their items can be formative, as in they're done in the training and they allow feedback, discussion, reflection, because they're developmental purposes. They're not testing purposes, okay? But I would still like the training learning community to know how to write good questions. So they can share the same kind of training rules, not producing the same thing, but they should be given the same kind of guidelines on what is a good item, what's a good distractor. So please, I think Tara has been very patient.
Thank you. Yeah. I love that. And in the chat, we've been talking about it too, like, okay, but the test content outline or your job analysis report goes online, or at least an executive summary of it, so it is public. I think one of the questions that came up for us was, at what point do those people within your organization who do test prep materials get to see that test content outline or, the results from your job analysis, because there's also kind of this idea of not wanting to give them there's this fine line between wanting them to do well because it's, our whole company and that's good, and not wanting them to have a really unfair advantage over other organizations that do test prep, that create test prep materials. So there were a lot of debates in our organization about can we share, we call it test content now, can we share our test content outline ahead of time? How much ahead of time? If yes, not, and if no, and or should we be, is it just go up online and then whoever happens to look sees it, or are you communicating it out to all test prep companies you know of, et cetera? So it does seem really straightforward until you start getting into the, the nuts and bolts of it. At least for us, it did. Others may have, the all exact right answer, and that would be lovely.
I mean, I would say that that's a really common question when folks call is some version of what can I give to my internal folks? And I remember when I was managing programs waffling with this exact question of when can we publish the updated blueprint and to whom? And the side of the fence that I know that I came down on personally, and you can always reach out to the commission if you want a formal answer, is that if it's not something that I would give to anybody who called to pick up the phone about the test, I couldn't share it with that education team. So they couldn't get the blueprint any earlier than I would give it to anybody else doing a prep course, because the standards talk about that your certification program must not give an unfair advantage to candidates who take your class versus somebody else's. So if you're giving your internal team an extra 6-month runway to prepare for changes to the blueprint, is that an unfair advantage? I know we have more hands.
I think Wallace, Judd.
Yeah, I'd like to add something. This conversation has certainly focused on multiple choice testing and content. If you take a look at performance testing and virtual reality testing, practice exam really needs to focus on user interface and how people are going to contend with interacting with the content. So it's a whole different world when you're working with either virtual reality or a performance test.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I feel like, I know Mihaela has her hand up, and you run a performance-based exam.
Yes,
say it better than me.
I would just say that I understand Wallace's point, and we don't use prep tests. We do have sample items, and we put them out just because we introduce scenario-based content. We moved away from multiple choice items, and we introduce other types of items, and we realized that candidates struggled even with the way the multiple choice items were written. So we wanted to make sure that they are familiar when we introduce changes to the test, they know how to navigate the scenario-based items, and that they will not have poor performance on the test because of the item format, since we were measuring the same content just differently. So I do understand that, and I can see the value for that, but that goes back to the point that was made earlier, that candidates need to be familiar with the standardization of the test. That to me speaks more to that aspect than to the content per se. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Great discussion. I think that helps then to tie into basically how are your organizations creating learning products that support the candidate success without compromising the integrity. So I know from our end with bench prep, we see the learners, they're improving on their scores. They're able to see real-time reporting on how they're doing, whether it's the multiple choice or scenario based. We have exam sim that essentially is going to simulate a Pearson or a Prometric test to reduce those kind of stress anxiety levels. So I guess where are your organizations at with that as well?
I think a lot of people certainly give resources of which they endorse, like books or research results or articles that isn't specific to any one domain, but relates to where the body of knowledge has been written, and the certification body has deemed it to be worthy of using as a study guide.
I would say for programs, there is this great emphasis on adult education and learning. So as programs go through and they look at test prep, are they talking about coaching, testing skills? Is that what their people need? Or are they really talking about what do those competencies look like? How do you develop those competencies? And those are two very different perspectives towards preparation for a certification exam. Both could theoretically have a place, depending on the nature of a certification program. But regardless of what pathway and what type of training is required, it still comes down to that. What's that separation of roles internally? How is that perceived by your public? And then just doing straight up evidence-based design of whatever it is you're building. Why are you building it that way? You're building things based upon your published blueprints, not things that are proprietary to your exam and your assessment team only. So I think just going back to the basics of what is it that your organization needs, that your program needs, and then how are you articulating that process to the public so they have confidence in whatever prep product you're putting out there.
Yeah, and we've said it a couple different ways, but that idea of removing test wiseness to the extent that we can, we don't want the noise in the scores, right? We want to know people's get as close as we can to what their knowledge and skills are, not knowledge and skills of how to be a good test taker, but knowledge and skills related to the content. So I think it comes down to removing content irrelevant, variables as much as possible.
Judy, I see your hand up.
I was just you kind of said it. First of all, you just separate what the purpose is. Are you preparing people, have been out work, has been years since they've seen a test, even if it's a multiple choice. What are you doing that way? If, however, you are in training, now this is not prep test, if your training is to develop capability in your domains, in that good training has testing in it, has formative tests. And that is a separate entity, right? So this question about I took somebody else's prep test and what you said disagrees. Well, you can't claim what other people do or don't do. What you can do is say that your preparatory programs, of which may have tests in them for formative testing purposes, are based on your job task analysis or your codified body of knowledge, whatever it is. But I think you have to be very clear about what you're trying to do. But I get very nervous when people say we don't want to help people get better. I think we do want to help people get better. We want to grow capability in our discipline. And we can offer products to help do that. But that is separate, as you're saying, from your the big certification exam. And those the players are different and what have you. But I think it's being very clear about what you're trying to accomplish. That's all.
Yeah, and there's a fine line to walk as well in terms of so many certification bodies want to do test prep as another string another stream of revenue. The thing is, there are others that make it all free, and that in their one of the reasons they do that is to remove the issue of access, and so that you're not unduly advantaging those people who have enough money to buy the products. So there are some real philosophical differences across organizations in terms of test prep.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and skip 2 slides because they're a bit redundant to kind of the conversations we've went with. So
So we're almost out of time.
we
I
are.
know.
I guess the last question I really just wanted to know from everyone actually is just if you are offering kind of exam prep, how are those candidates responding?
I'll say a quick note if you don't mind, and then I'll move out of the way. We have had mixed responses to test prep materials as a whole. For the readiness tests that we've been doing, we've gotten really good responses in terms of those people who wanted it to, because we advertise it for a way to lower test anxiety. And for those people who had that in mind when they were taking it, felt that it self-report, but felt that it absolutely did make them feel more comfortable walking in to take the certification exam.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. So I wanted to just then go ahead and open this up for everyone right now. What questions, comments? I know the chat's been buzzing throughout this whole panel, but is there anything that someone wants to address or bring up as we have about 15 minutes or so left? Or any further questions that we could help with? No? Okay, well, thank you all for attending today.
Sorry, I have a question. I couldn't find a microphone icon. So I put my question up higher and then probably buried. But I wanted to have any guidance or thought from you about localization in a sense of translating content into, usually English is the source language, into another language. My team handles the translation of educational materials as well as certification content. My thought is that, translation is not a content creation or development. We're just converting one language into another. I agree that the firewall applies to the point that we shouldn't involve anybody who is teaching or who may create training content. But for those people who are just converting content in English into another language, shouldn't have to, follow this firewall. Any thought on this?
I just want to make sure I understand. So are you saying that the people who are translating your prep course materials are also translating your exam content materials?
Yes. Well, we haven't been yet, but we will. We're thinking to position our function in that way.
I mean, the NCCA is very firm about the firewall. People that are doing prep do not do the exam. And the perspective here is that when you're translating an exam, it's not, well, the NCCA doesn't permit just simple translation. So you can't just do a simple translation. You can't just do back translation because there is that nuance. So they have to fundamentally understand not only the language skills, but also the technical piece of that content. And it's that technical piece that makes that firewall so integral to maintaining the integrity. So if they fundamentally understand the technical aspects of the exam in order to translate it, then they also would not be eligible to then translate that prep material because they'd be coming in with that insider knowledge that may give an undue advantage to people taking the prep course.
Yes, Sam, you have your hand up and it looks like you're chiming in too if you want to give your perspective. Oh, and I just lost her.
Who you were asking for perspective?
Sam had her hand up.
Evan.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I
Looks
don't
like
see her anymore.
I think
I'll just say that 17,024 would feel the same way. Somebody with
Sorry.
technical experts doing the
There we
prep.
go. I had to turn my mic on
those.
on Zoom. When we have validation, we have subject matter experts that do our translation validation after a professional translator translates for us. So they write, that's for the body of knowledge. That's open because that's a public document. But our translators who translate exam items in the item bank, they can't work for an organization that offers a prep program, and they need to either hold the certification before they come in within the last 3 years, or they have to wait for 2 years after the pilot exam is launched before they could sit for the exam, because by then we will have revised the pilot and written new items and created at least 6 to 8 new exam forms. So if you see the exam content, no dice anywhere else other than staff.
Yeah, for example, program teams are also separate, like who are managing those projects are also separate between prep materials and then certification content.
We don't translate preparation materials or prep programs. We do have members of our organization who do present materials in other languages.
Okay.
They happen to be preparation programs that are not in the language we offer the exams in at the moment. So they're more specialized Nordic languages. We offer German, French, Spanish, English, and they're going to move into one others. But the prep program is still separate. They can't have access to the exam content.
I see. Thank you very much.
Roy, I know you were in the middle of giving your input too. Did you want to go ahead and finish that before we wrap up here?
No, I think I said it that what was discussed in the translator doing prep and exam certainly wouldn't be acceptable under 17,024 either. We would consider uh, being a threat to validity of the examination.
Roy, did we get to hear your community college example?
Oh, well, first of all, you would think, and I'll do it in 2 minutes. You would think it would be a fairly simple process of taking an industry certification that would relate to a degree pathway and be able to do it. But because of the different conceptualizations between higher ed and the certification world, it takes a real effort to even have them understand the test blueprint, and then are the courses in alignment, and then if it's in alignment, where it fits in the sequence of that. We also know that if the examination is not offered, and this is right now about community colleges, if the exam is not offered right at the community college, if it's voluntary, the likelihood of them adding certification to their degree pathway is not going to happen. They won't go 20 miles even to do it. And so it's this synthesizing them to the standardization process and access, convenient access for, besides the alignment, that all has to be considered when we are starting to look at how to integrate credentials.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Again, this was a great discussion today, and I really appreciate everyone being interactive and engaging. It's nice to have so many people attend and give various perspectives on your roles and what your organizations offer. So thank you so much. with that being said, we will have a recording of this, so feel free to reach out to us directly if you have any questions. Also, feel free to, if you want to connect with us on LinkedIn here too, we can help. Chris, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to you, and you can go ahead and close this out.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. This was great. Great session. Great start to our programming for 2025. Virtual is different, but I think it was great that we actually, I think even more interaction. I think in person is interactive, but it's also hard in those big rooms to have interactive discussions. So I think this was great. Just a few quick things. One, our next meeting is on the 14th of May in Chicago. So we're looking forward to that. You all should be getting emails, reminders about that. Please sign up if you're in the Chicago area, or if you're like me, I'm in DC and I'll be flying to Chicago and I'll be at the meeting in May. And then finally, at the end is sort of an in-person tradition that we usually have, but I'll throw it out there today. If anyone has any announcements, especially any job openings, I see as people all scurry off of the call, so probably not too many, but if anyone has anything they want to throw in, any job openings or any other announcements for their organization that would be relevant to CNG, this is your opportunity. Okay, opportunity is gone. And I will say we had 100, I think the high water mark was 158 attendees. So that's pretty awesome. So very excited to see that. And we look forward to seeing everyone on our next virtual event. So thanks everybody and have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.